Hi, everybody. This is my first podcast, and I'm happy to have Emmy Chahal on the show. We're going to talk about vulnerability, which was Emmy's idea when I asked her. Hi, Emmy. How you doing?
Hi, Glenn. I'm good. I'm so honored to be your first guest. Yeah, I'm
Very
excited.
excited. Yes. And I would like to acknowledge the land where I'm on and where I've lived since I was 6 years old. I was an immigrant from India, from Mumbai, and grew up in Surrey, and now I'm living in Vancouver. So Vancouver is the traditional ancestral unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm very grateful and humbled to be able to have lived here for so long. It's a beautiful part of the world. And yeah, it's there's a lot of work still to do in terms of decolonization around the world and in Canada, certainly. But, I think a land acknowledgement is an important part of that work.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'd like to acknowledge the land I'm on as well is unceded ancestral rightful territory of the Syilx Nation. And I am so lucky to have lived here in the past for 5 years while I was going to university, actually. And my ancestors are all from the north of India. And I think maybe Glenn, you can relate, but I have a complex identity as both a settler and someone who has been formerly colonized, and therefore feel the need to really stand in solidarity with all of my Indigenous friends and to be a voice of decolonization for my own people, but also to help others in their quest for liberation from colonialism. And I think Canada is in like a reckoning period right now of just really seeing the horror that has always been here, but that I think for a long time people were not looking at or listening or acknowledging. So I just want to say my deepest gratitude to the guardians and the ancestors and the people that live here, continue to live here, that are resilient, that are doing amazing work. A lot of my work is inspired by my Indigenous friends. So I always want to preface every conversation by extending my deepest gratitude and honoring of this land and acknowledging that I am a settler here. Like most of us, uninvited guests, and that's hard to reckon with. I think being a displaced person as well, someone who's experienced genocide in India through my grandparents, in their generation, it's complex and complicated, but I'm willing to go to that and very think it's very important to look at those aspects of our identity.
Thank you. So what vulnerability just popped out of your mouth when I asked you what you wanted to talk about? Why was that?
Yeah, it was pretty spontaneous, actually. I think it was maybe because I was so inspired by you publishing your poetry and then I published my poetry, which was really a lot of vulnerability in my book. And in my relationships and talking about, deep, intimate things in my heart and sharing it with people. But I was really inspired by reading your book because it made me believe that it was possible to self-publish and to just share. And it was a really beautiful read. So I guess that's why vulnerability came up. But also I'm just interested in that as a concept, especially relating to gender and gender expression.
Yeah, cool. And your book is called Love Exposure,
It's
right?
called Love Exposure Poetry for Healing the Heart. Yeah.
Wonderful. Where can people get it?
Yeah, thanks. They can just get it on my website, which is emmychahal.com, EMMYCHAHAL.com. But it's interesting because I don't know if you had this struggle as an author or writer, but I battled with myself about whether to put it on Amazon because of Amazon and the kind of things that happened in that company. So I decided not to. But I think for future books, I'm writing a book right now. I think I would like to go through a publisher. Yeah.
Great.
Eventually,
Okay.
maybe self-published to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So you have a background as and skills as a teacher, writer, healer. Um, so there are lots of ways to get to the topic of vulnerability through there. Where would you like to go? How would you like to approach it?
Well, I always loved talking about my healing work because it was inspired by my grandmother. It was passed down in my family, it's ancestral. Um, and there's two parts to it. There's the energy healing, intuitive energy healing that I do, that's body focused, but also holistic and multidimensional in itself. And then there's the yoga part. So if I zoom in on the healing lens, I think that's a good place to start to talk about vulnerability because, you know, um, the skills that I learned, in courses, like I did courses like therapeutic touch and holistic, massage courses, Thai massage, aromatherapy, that kind of thing. But really the deepest healing I think that I learned and aim to embody is through my family, through my grandparents. My grandmother specifically is the inspiration behind my business. So vulnerability, yeah, through a healing lens, I would be interested in talking about that.
Yeah, for sure. Um, you know, I kind of like it when people ask me challenging questions, so I'm not going to hold back with you. Emmy and I are friends, and some of this ground we haven't covered before. So,
Go for it.
um,
I'm ready.
yeah, I'm sure you are. How do you think your personal healing work relates to the healing work that you do?
Good question. I think it's directly a reflection, actually. The things that I work through internally that I, have to often take time out of my life to attend to, spending time with my internal landscape, my daily practices, really investing in my healing is what led me to become a healer. I don't think there's any other way you can do it. The wounded healer archetype or someone who's been there or that peer, equal relationship of someone who's been there comes up all the time with clients where themes, that I'm working through or have working through or, a past thing or a present thing often will be reflected in my clients. So one of my teachers, who is an incredible intuitive named Dr. Divi, she would often say, and this goes like really meta, she'd say that every client is a holographic reflection of your spirit. So, every every person is showing you an aspect of yourself, and relationships can be that doorway into understanding who and why we're here, who we are and why we're here. So it's a really interesting question. It makes me think about all the people that have been through really rough experiences and then alchemize that pain into a gift. Those are the people I have so much deep respect for, and I think I am doing that work as well.
Yeah, cool. Um, would you be comfortable sharing what areas of healing you've done for yourself and what areas of healing you feel that you have special skills for with others?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny, it brings up that vulnerability again, doesn't it? So when I was in my early 20s, um, I had an experience of, I guess, being really burnt out as a teenager. I had a very early experience when I was 13 of winning a CBC contest that thrust me into the limelight. And I was on national TV and, it's pretty insane. I was 13 and I was sent to Scotland to report on the Harry Potter book launch and all these kids were jealous of me. But I was suddenly, having cameras in my living room and, on all these TV shows and radio shows. And I loved broadcasting and for the longest time wanted to be a broadcaster. But that experience, I think, set me up for a very high standard as a teenager. And I felt like I needed to save the world or live up to some big expectation of what adults had for me. They'd often say, oh, you have so much promise and potential. And then I would feel like I had to live up to that. So I took on so much and I really tried to be the perfect person. And, I was doing 12 extracurriculars as a high school student and it was just ridiculous. And I burnt out and in my early 20s, I was really fortunate to be offered a scholarship to UBCO where I was here actually on Sea Lake territory. And, I had a very big spiritual awakening. It was spiritual, but also mental and emotional in nature. And I grew up practicing Kundalini yoga. And in the spiritual traditions that I was raised in, there's a very strong energy that moves up the nervous system, up the spine, this blue light that connects you to all there is. And I had a Kundalini awakening in a place that doesn't understand what that is. So the trauma I experienced was mainly in the medical system. I was involuntarily admitted to the hospital and I was forcibly drugged, and I had to work out why. And that led me on a healing quest for the following, I guess, 8 years, 8 to almost 10 years now, traveling and learning from different healers and trying every modality. And I really think I was blessed to have a family that could afford alternative mental health care. They invested in me, and I was able to have a naturopath who specialized in orthomolecular neuroscience. I was able to get access to things like body talk or, everything. Like my parents were really great in the sense that they supported my healing journey, and would do whatever it took for me to recover. And I can safely say that I have been fully recovered for the past 6 or 7 years. And I don't think that's a story that gets heard a lot around mental health. We don't hear about all the people that recover. We only hear about the people in, through the lens of the DSM-4, where you're given a life sentence for something that can be very, in my case, circumstantial, trauma informed. Trauma was a big part of it, and ancestral. Dealing with intergenerational trauma from genocide leaves its impact on all of our psyches. My grandparents lived through a massive genocide. So yeah, I think that's where I would stop. And yeah, in terms of sharing about my healing journey, or maybe where I'd start. I don't know, but that's probably the major thing that I help people with is emotional balance.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing so
You're
much about
welcome.
yourself. I appreciate that. Sure, people who watch or listen to this will as well. Um, you you are also a writer um, and a poet specifically. Um, do you see your process as an artist, or I don't know if you call yourself an artist or as a poet? Is that essentially like very closely bound up with healing, or is it also more than that? Do you see it as something
Mm.
else or in addition to?
Interesting question. Yeah, really, really good question. I think I consider myself an artist. I think a lot of artists battle with their inner world, because they're channeling. To me, artists are channeling a higher self or some kind of spirit or an inspiration, or they're expressing something that's intangible. And, here with the pandemic, we've really seen what happens when we don't have art, when we don't have access to theater or music or concerts. And life kind of is, at least for me, drained of some of its vibrancy, its color, its meaning, its connection. And artists historically in this society have not been supported. I mean, sure, there's like patrons and there's people that, give money to artists, which is very important. But in terms of like other countries in the world, in Norway, my friend's mother was an artist and the government paid her a steady income because they knew that her income wouldn't be steady. So they did that for artists. And I thought how revolutionary, and Scandinavia also has amazing mental health policy, things like open dialogue, no forcible drugging, no restraint. And all of these things happen in Canada still. People who haven't experienced the mental health care system don't realize how violating it is of our human rights. So yes, I think creatives, being an artist is directly connected to healing. Some of the geniuses in history can now be quote unquote diagnosed with some kind of retrospective mental illness, but I don't even really think that that's all there is to the story. I think that mental health is holistic health. And I think those of us that are different, that are divergent, or that are creative, that are in touch with our creative center, are doing something that the mainstream doesn't really support. Unfortunately, I don't think our society is as creative as it could be. But those of us that are stepping into our truth and expressing and transforming and alchemizing, and especially social artists really inspire me, social activist artists. Like, I don't know if you know Michaela Cole, but she wrote an amazing TV series called I May Destroy You. And I really recommend that if folks haven't seen it. It's intense. It's about, recovery from sexual assault and the internal journey of the protagonist. And it's based on her own life. But it's so witty and so well done, especially that last episode. And so that kind of work, I can see the direct link between creativity and healing. And as a poet, I feel like poems just come through me. That's one of my main gifts, I think, is automatic writing. It's just like turning off my mind and just channeling while I'm writing.
Yeah, and if anybody's been on Emmy's Instagram, you'll see how articulate she is, and how there's no shortage of things to say. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to invite you to be a guest, because we could talk endlessly.
I'm a chatty Cathy, basically.
Yeah. So you mentioned social artists and activism there. Do you see links between art, healing, and politics, social change on a larger scale, systemic change?
Oh, that's a good question. And I would love to hear your perspective on it too. Yeah, I mean, Banksy is such a really, amazing cross-section of healing, politics, and creativity. What did you say that he was healing in there? Was that your question?
Yeah, that's right. Healing,
yeah.
Healing art and
yeah.
politics.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe he's not so much a healer, but he's a questioner, a rebel. And I lived in Bristol, England for almost a year, or off and on. Yeah, probably closer to 6 months actually. But I lived in Bristol. I was born in England. And I got to see the original Banksy. He's from Bristol. So that was really amazing, that kind of street art, like revolutionary vibe, living in that city. But, I don't know if there are so many people doing all three of those. I'm trying to think of anybody else that I can think of. I'm sure there are. I mean, like the Dixie Chicks, like when they were commenting on, the Not Ready to Make Nice song about being basically their music being burnt and horrible things happening to them because they denounced George Bush. And then, yeah, I love singers. Also like Kesha, who had her producer basically be her assaulter, and then taking him to court and then writing about it in her Rainbow CD was so inspiring to listen to. Beyonce's Lemonade, like, yeah, all of these like people. Pink is an amazing artist that bridges healing and she's so mainstream too, and politics. One of her older songs, like Dear Mr. President, I almost felt like she redid it recently. I'm trying to remember what song it was, but oh yeah, What About Us, right? Like that song totally questions, the people, like how is the government representing the people? And I've thought of myself about one day going into politics, but not for a while, because it's so intense. Like I think I would do like municipal politics or something that was smaller scale. But yeah, I would like to see more of that cross section personally. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I do. Well, a lot. I mean, I guess I feel that anytime people are doing work that's creative on a deep level, on a soul level, there's some healing going on, or some value, some opening up, some expression, and that can stay in the private sphere, and it can still have benefits with friends, family, colleagues, people that we interact with. But in my view, and I don't know if you agree, that the major issue of our time is the climate crisis. And so I personally, even before I was aware of the climate crisis, I didn't feel myself that staying in the private sphere was enough. And I think partly for me, there were formative moments of the famine in Ethiopia, I think was in 85 when I was 14. And it was shocking to see, starving children, for example. And then going back to India, I left when I was 6. I went back when I was 16 and was just devastated by the poverty. So I felt that, on some level, everything that I do is intended towards benefit. And to the extent that I can free myself and, both in terms of healing and in terms of creative work, I think, that can also have an effect on others. And yeah, I think it's one of the things that I'd like to, shift or bring to dialogue is how quickly people can declare their political allegiances, like partisan politics, because people are typically very shy about that, reluctant. So I voted NDP for a long time. And then recently I became a member of the BC Greens and the Federal Greens. And I don't think it has to be an either or of, the political system or like on the street activism, because I've attended lots of protests and signed lots of petitions and so on. So I don't think it's an either or, but those are politics. I've heard politics defined as the art of the possible. And there's a lot of creativity in politics. And I think it's important. When I was a part of Occupy Vancouver, there was this sense that spirituality and politics were unified, were brought together as they are in few figures, I was thinking, at that time I was thinking of Bob Marley. Gandhi is famous for this, Martin Luther King Jr. But that combination of religion and spirituality, religion and politics, it can be Tinder, it can be very dangerous. But it can, when you're part of it and you feel that it's democratic and empowering to people who were previously, marginalized in some way or feeling disempowered, it's very, that was one of the times that I felt most alive, when I was, outside the art gallery participating in a general assembly, and sometimes the general assembly was 12 people and sometimes it was 300 people. Anyway, so I've got a lot to say about it, but
yeah, it's so interesting too, that cross-section of religion and politics. It's like those are the two things you shouldn't talk about, but when they come together, that's so interesting in terms of leadership, in terms of like Marianne Williamson running, in terms of all these presidents of the states saying God bless America, or Canada being founded on Judeo-Christian ideals, right? And for the longest time in our laws, witchcraft was illegal. I think it's pretty recently that it stopped being illegal. So those that practice Wicca were illegal. So I'm really interested in what does the new paradigm or the new attitude toward leadership and politics and government, how can it be diverse? Because we haven't had diverse leaders in this country, unfortunately. We haven't even really had a woman. Like that's crazy. Pakistan has had a woman, and what I heard about you saying earlier about Ethiopia, I was like hearing a humanitarian tone in what you were saying. And I think for me, I identify more as a humanitarian than a politics person or politician person. I don't see myself as a political person in the sense of publicly, but the personal is political, right? That's the basis of feminism. Personal is political. So I know that even just walking around in the world, living my life how I believe is the best I can do, and giving to others and being of service, I think that's still political, especially when we can have conversations that are new and that are not typically heard. Like just the fact that people of color underrepresented in the arts. Or my friend Zahida, for example, had written an amazing play. She's a young, person of color, female playwright. And the barriers that she has faced in Vancouver's theater scene are astronomical. It took her years to find someone that would put on her play. And then when the Culture finally did, they removed it. They took it back. They said no. They said yes initially, and then they said no for no reason. They wouldn't give her a good reason. So this kind of racism inspires me to take to politics, because I do think that that's where you can make some change, top down and bottom up, like both, But what about this, like, why are politicians removed from activists? Like, why is there this hierarchy, and how could it be more across the field, spectrum oriented?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I'd like to talk a bit about your work as a teacher, because teaching certainly has a political dimension. It's necessarily social. How do you see, I mean, sort of two parts to this question. You can answer either or both. Do you see teaching as political in some sense? And also, do you see what for you are the connections between teaching and healing and art, being a poet?
That's a good question. Teaching is political and also as healing and art. Yeah, teaching is political. I've never thought of it that way before, but it is, because undoubtedly our own power dynamics, or our biases, or our prejudices show up in the classroom. And when I was at university, I did a study on embodied pedagogy. So learning through the body, bringing yoga and meditation into the university classroom. And I've taught for several different post-secondary institutions doing embodiment in different capacities, like when I was at EBCO, I was like the campus yoga teacher. So I was, doing many different capacities of yoga. But what I found really interesting was academically studying how learning through the body shifted people's perception. Like if we just took a deep breath, and we like collectively moved energy or felt our feet and just slowed down when things got heated, and the teacher was able to hold space, then the learning was different and improved, is what we found. The journal entries were deeper. Most people really enjoyed the embodiment aspect. They could like let go of what they were doing before, and they could just really relax into the classroom, into the dynamic. But our society here on Turtle Island is so fast. It's like constant, so slowing down teaching interests me. I've thought a lot about starting a forest school and taking teaching into the natural world and learning about plants and indigenous plants, and highlighting the gifts of every child, the inherent gifts of the child, and supporting that process. And that was actually what I was going to do for my master's, and then I declined my master's to do a more practical project. But I'm really interested in that. How do we shape the world through education, but not the Western idea of education, because there are so many other types of education that are valuable. Living in a classroom for however many years that I did, 12 or 13 years, I don't know, it really didn't work for me, even though I was succeeding at it. It was not good for my mental health or my physical health. So I'd like to bring a new model of education into the world, and, start a new way of looking at teaching.
That sounds great. Yeah. I'm curious about whether you've had any epiphanies along these three paths. You probably had multiple ones, but what comes to mind? And for example, this could be one way of answering the question, is that, often an epiphany will come after a challenge. So have you felt, you can pick one of those three areas, teaching, healing, and creating. or more. And maybe if you feel comfortable talking about something that was difficult for you, but then maybe seeing it from another perspective helped you have a breakthrough of some kind.
Yeah, I think I will take the healing lens again. And I think an epiphany that came to me was that I can't change other people. I can't change other people. I think there's a part of me that really wants things to be a certain way, or that has a vision, and sometimes can get a bit fixated on it and kind of like, this world should be different, and why is it like this, and this kind of rebellious teenager in me that really does see a better way of doing business, or doing, you know, I don't know, like the way we treat the earth, for example. There's anger there that sometimes comes into it, and then my relationships suffer. Then I bring anger. If I don't deal with my anger, I don't give it a chance to release in a healthy way, then it impacts my relationships. And I think for a long time, I was looking for a romantic relationship to complete me, or to feel like this person saw me and got me and understood me, because I had an experience of not really belonging, in the traditional sense of, society or school or whatever. I was a butterfly. I could go to different places, but I never really landed until I started thinking about trauma. And that's when things really shifted, when I was studying trauma sensitive yoga and looking at why, for example, in my research, another student had a full blown anxiety attack when I was leading a breathing exercise, and we had moved the chairs in the room. And then she had a full blown anxiety attack. And how did we move through that as a classroom? The guilt that I felt as a teacher, so much. I couldn't change her. I couldn't change her. And I couldn't change the way that people are in their bodies, because that's not for me to do. And so releasing the idea that I needed to fix things or fix people, and instead really coming inward and saying, how can I embrace this moment? How is life happening for me, not to me? I'm not a victim of whatever challenge happened. And maybe I need to let other people have their challenges and just listen, and not necessarily give them advice, just like hold back a bit, and just not need to please them, not need to give them an answer, not need to make them happy. This was all my cultural conditioning as an Indian woman, to be very pleasing, demure, say what people want, this very like, and that was never me. I was just loud, and expressive, and feeling oriented and creative and embodied. I'm embodied. And I think a lot of people are not in touch with their body. So learning that I can't change people, and I can learn to accept myself and love my body, and just come into the moment. Um, just accept it. Not good, not bad, just acceptance.
Yeah, yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. Um, do you think we can change ourselves? Or to what
That,
extent?
that's a great question. I'm really interested in neuroplasticity and embodiment, and reimagining the stories that we tell ourselves, rewriting our belief systems. We can do it, I believe, but it takes a lot of practice and commitment to your healing journey. And I know sometimes it's tempting to just kind of dabble in healing when it's like pleasant, and, but what really transforms us is when we get into the muck of the shadow, and then we've had some conversations about death psychology and Jungian stuff. And, I love that. There's something really awesome about getting comfortable with negative emotions, or negative, what's perceived in our world as negative things, but really they're all part of the path of being human. Like, we can't divorce ourselves from our anger or our sadness or our guilt or our shame. We can welcome our shame. We can hold our shame. We can see that it's a part of us that's trying to protect us. Our shame is trying to protect us from something. That kind of emotional work has been transformative for me, and I believe it can help so many others. Whether people are ready for it is another question. It cannot be imposed or forced or like pushed. You can't push healing on anybody. But I do think when we choose and we're willing and we're committed and we intend to transform, then the universe aligns to support us in that intention. The universe sends us teachers, sends us healers, sends us um, signs. We're always able to determine our path. There was this quote that I loved as a teenager that was like, you know, you're not a tree, move. Like if something's not working, you're not a tree, just move, get up and change. And movement has been a way that I've helped my neural pathways rewire. Physical exercise, dance, expression, movement with others, music, like movement, I think can help us heal. So yeah, I do think we can change ourselves. Is it easy? No, not always. Sometimes, but not always.
Yeah. Here's a question I've been wondering about for a long time. Um, Something like what is the dance between acceptance or the journey towards self-acceptance on the one hand and the intention to transform?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do we work that out? Because one of my thoughts on this is that to the extent that we accept ourselves, something loosens and there's a shift. you know there's a kind of self-forgiving, for example, and that in itself can be part of the shift or transformation. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, it reminds me of like being versus doing, or becoming and accepting. This dual, like we live in a dualistic universe. There's both, and there's day, there's night, there's dichotomy, there's binaries, and I think we are moving toward a oneness consciousness of feeling unity within ourselves and in the wider world, unity with nature, unity with each other. But to get to that place means looking at the duality, which is so ironic. So I think holding two things at once is possible. So we can accept ourselves, and there's a part of us that wants to bloom, that wants to blossom, that wants to transform and explore and grow. And I think this is the natural impulse of the universe, is expansion and then contraction. Expansion and contraction. And when I started to see that those moments of contraction where nothing was happening, I felt stuck, they were not bad or wrong, or we don't need to always be growing. Life is cyclical. Then I could really rest. And those moments of acceptance and rest and stopping and pausing were like the refueling for the transformative path forward. And I'm an Aries in in my sun sign, and I'm all fire signs, my moon in Leo and my rising in Sagittarius. So I know not everyone's into astrology, but I really am. And the Aries in me is a very pioneering force that in the outer world is like pushing forward, and I can have that capacity to lead and create and do things in the world. But then there's a part of me that really needs to retreat and hermit and be still and just like not like just rest. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that, is that there's both polarities. They're always working together, but the art and the skill is to know which part of the cycle you're in.
That's great answer. um, do you feel comfortable talking about Saturn returns?
Oh yeah. Love
Okay.
it. What about Saturn returns?
Well, I don't know, are you able to talk about your age and what this means
Yeah.
for you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's weird that age is kind of like a taboo. Like I've been thinking about aging a lot because I was talking to someone and they were saying, "Oh, I'm getting old and I'm looking bad." And I'm like, "No, you're just evolving. You're just changing." It's almost like we rent these earth seats for a while and then we have to give them back to the earth. Like I feel like that with so many things. We're here for a short time. So yeah, I'm 29 and I'm in the middle of my I guess, yeah, in the middle of my Saturn return. I found out my yin Saturn return happened last, whatever, April or something. It already happened. And then my yang Saturn return, the more mental Saturn return, is happening this coming February. And it's been a major rejigging of my life. For those that don't know what Saturn return is, it's basically Saturn, the planet of time, discipline, structure, coming back every 28 years to where it was when you were born. So around 28 to 31, Saturn will reroute you on your path if you're not on it. And it can be ruthless. Like, it can be really like going through the ringer. Big changes happen around 28 to 31. And then I guess big changes are always happening. But according to astrology, you know, this planetary transit causes people to kind of reevaluate their life and decide what path they're on and whether it's the right one for them. So yeah, I mean, my mom had me when she was in her Saturn return, which makes that relationship really interesting because now she's in her second Saturn return and I'm in my Saturn return. And, you know, we kind of came to a head in our relationship, but we're healing through it. We're talking again, which is good. But in terms of like my life, I do feel like it's changing massively. I was working a lot in the corporate sector. I was doing a lot of, you know, speaking and corporate yoga and meditation for tech companies. And I was really on this like hamster wheel in the city of trying to prove myself and trying to make money. I mean, being self-employed for the last 3 years, I finally got to a place where I was paying my bills, and that was a massive relief. I know it's really hard for all entrepreneurs, but unfortunately, our systems, again, do not support young entrepreneurs, especially young female entrepreneurs who are not married. You know, to live on one income as a self-employed woman in Vancouver is like next to impossible. And if it wasn't for the family that was behind me, supporting me, catching me if I was falling, you know, because I did a few times, you know, that dwindling bank account was such a wake-up call to what are my priorities. And during the pandemic, the one thing that was there for me was community gardening and growing food, which is what all of my ancestors did. And I just knew that I needed a quieter, closer to nature, more utopian life. You know, I needed to be closer to nature. So that's what I'm doing is I'm moving. And I'm creating a project called the Everglow Project, which is about sustainable agriculture, sustainable architecture, and community. And it's a long-term vision.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that word because I think of you as a visionary. People have probably said that of you before. And so that's a very powerful gift and privilege and responsibility, because as you said earlier, there's a subtle balance between, or dynamic between, you know, having a vision and not wanting to impose it on others, you know. And I think, as you were saying earlier, there's this tension among humans with what is and what should be. And that causes a lot of complications. But I think it's part of the human experience, you know, because we're conscious that we're going to die. I feel like we're the only species that knows that. And so we have this sense of, well, what are, you know, the best choices I could make between now and then? And this notion of living your best life and how that can feel like a lot of pressure, you know, like the best, the maximal, you know, profit, return on investment maximized kind of thing. So, but yeah, so do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wonder what's wrong with ordinary. Like, why can't we just bring the sacred into the everyday? You know, for me, farming is a great example of that. You know, when I'm growing food or I'm in the field or I'm with my friends, and farmers, by the way, are treated horribly in our society. They're not paid well. They're under incredibly harsh working conditions. You know, it's smoky here in the Okanagan, and people are still in the fields feeding us, and we don't even appreciate them. You know, this is something that I really feel called to share with the world, like the joy of eating and food and growing food and growing community and creating beautiful spaces for conversations to happen, for healing to happen, for creativity to happen. You know, one of my dreams for the land is that it has a recording studio on it, you know, so that people could do their podcasts or their music in nature. I was really inspired by Taylor Swift's Long Pond sessions because she went to this cabin during COVID with all these other musicians and recorded an album live. And she was, when you watch the footage of her, I think it's on like Disney Plus or something, you know, you can see that the environment is shaping her emotions and that it's making her feel safe to express. And so that was something that, yeah, I feel I want to facilitate. But when you were saying earlier, you know, the shoulds, like the way things should be, or that consciousness that we're going to die, I think that's all the realm of the mind, the realm of our psyche. And yoga is really about connecting with the body to become aware of the mind, to become still in meditation and observe the mind. And, you know, Patanjali would say the still, calm lake of the mind is what the aim is. We're aiming for that reflective state of the mind and not the tumultuous waves that, you know, modern life is imposing. So there is this highly out of balance yang energy in the world that we need to do the best. And I totally felt that. I mean, this is like recurring theme in my life is burnout, you know, like recurring. And I have slowly started to realize that if I go on my own pace, which is like, we have yardsticks too. We're like, by 30, I want this, or by whatever, we have expectations. What if I had no expectations? What I had no expectations of my romantic life, no expectations of my parents, no expectations of my career. I just showed up and did what was in my heart to do and served others. You know, that's, I think, what my ancestors would say is like service, simple living. I think about my grandmother. She had so much love to give everybody. And she really, really was connected to spirit, to the source of all things. And she would really merge with music in the temple. You know, she would just become one with it. And that love of the universe was in everything she did. So, yeah.
Sounds wonderful. Yeah. I agree with you when you say that, well, part of what I hear you saying is that our alienation from our bodies, which is also our emotions, our emotional state, I think that has led to, you know, part of the excesses of capitalism, and also the damage that we've done on the climate, because we don't see the earth as a body. And often this mental energy can be oriented around what is best for me, you know, or what is best for my partner, or what is best for my children, or, you know, me, you know, that little world, focusing on how can I make that better. Mm-hmm. And this concept of an other, yeah. I can't take care of everybody, well, that's true, but it doesn't mean that you have to create this other that you simply give up on or renege on your responsibility for, right? So I feel like there's some connection between our disconnection with our own bodies and with the body of the earth.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I think that this is also a divorcing of the feminine. It's the refusal to acknowledge the body's wisdom, and the body doesn't lie. In my trauma sensitive training, my teachers would say, you store your issues in your tissues. Our memories are in our cellular memory. You smell something and it takes you back to when you're 5, or someone touches you in a certain way and it brings back a memory, or, there's so much held in our bodies, and these vehicles are treated like, well, most people I don't think even know that they have a body these days. They're kind of in the head and up, right? They're sort of in that mind trance of, I need to do this, do this, do this, and they're missing life. And as soon as we put our hand on our belly or put our hand on our heart or just slow down and become aware of our breathing, we actually experience the present moment. Our mind is usually, it's just the mind's job. There's that saying, the mind is a great servant, but a terrible master, or whatever. It's a horrible master. If you're always in your mind, it can be hell, And so when we come into the welcoming home of the body, it's almost like, the feminine is connected to that, because, well, I'm just thinking about the womb, and, we all were in someone else's body at one point, right? In our mother's body. And we all are on this earth, and we're all, nature is always doing its thing all around us, but how many of us are really admiring and sitting with that, and really watching nature, and really, you're someone, Glenn, that I think really does that. You really do appreciate nature, and you really take that time to breathe in the scene, and it's really beautiful to see someone do that, because honestly, I think most people are just like in the story of their head all the time, because that's how we've been conditioned to live in this yang capitalist, patriarchy, whatever you want to call it, like this control dominated, conquer the earth, I don't like that term, but rape the earth. Like, this is what we're doing to the earth, is we're fracking, and I think a lot of people who are connected to their bodies, regardless of their gender, feel a rage about, if they're sensitive, about what's happening to the earth. It's like, how could we have gotten so far off track? It's not the problem somewhere over there. The problem is here in North America, in the developed world. There's something so wrong with the way that we're living. And my Indigenous friends, and my witchy friends, and my earth-based healing friends, and my shaman friends have answers. They have a new model of how we can live in harmony and respect and integrity and relationship to nature. And I really think that the more people connect with nature and breathe in nature and forest bathe and run and bike, and in BC, for example, I think a lot of people find their spirituality in nature because it's so stunningly beautiful, that almost religion isn't necessary anymore, for maybe not everybody, but for a lot of people. I would say that we're moving away from religion and into some new idea of what God is, or what spirit is. And honestly, I think spirit to me is really in everything. It's in the earth, it's in our body, it's in our relationships. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also feel that, whereas previously the language around the climate crisis used to be, not just, oh, this is happening in other countries. It's happening in countries that are close to the equator, or it's happening at the poles. So not just spatially has it been clearly brought home to us in the Pacific Northwest, for example, with wildlife smoke, or with wildfire smoke, and the heat of this summer, like breaking heat records, but also generationally. We used to say things like, well, it's going to make things worse for your grandchildren or your children. What's happening now?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's very immediate and very visceral, as you say. And, one only has to look, or to smell, or to feel in your body the shift in temperature to know that this is going on, so yeah, we've created systems where, even though many people would acknowledge, certainly many Canadians, I would say at least, would acknowledge that either at least there's climate change, maybe there's a climate emergency or climate crisis, but as humans, we haven't created systems that can adapt quickly enough to take up the seriousness and the widespread aspect of that alarm. Right, the alarm is ringing, and we don't know how to get out of the house.
I think we do know how to get out of the house, but we don't like to be uncomfortable and give up our super luxurious lives. Like I think that this is something that humans do when we're in pain or suffering. We move away from it. We don't like to be in pain, and to feel in the body what's happening requires enormous strength, enormous courage, enormous capacity, so many skills. Like those skills were never taught to us. We were never taught to feel where anger sits in the body and then to move it out so that it doesn't project into our relationships. We were never taught to let our tears flow if we were especially male identified in public, in a meeting, in a boardroom. Like if the wisdom of the body had been honored in the decisions that have put us here, we wouldn't be here. But the body and the feminine and the earth was left out of those conversations because we were in our minds. We were in our minds about what was going to create more greed, more growth, more of everything. We were in a growth obsession, and we were not cyclical, and we have made massive mistakes as humanity, and we have not treated other species with the respect they deserve. And now we are noticing how small we are. I had a very transformative experience of being in a hurricane, and 52 people died in that hurricane. And thankfully I lived, and so did my family. But it was life-changing for me because I started to be able to reawaken the inherent gifts that I believe so many of us have as children. These are the gifts that my grandmother, nurtured in me and had in herself. The gifts of connecting through plants, through animals, and communicating. She would teach me how to connect to a tree through my hand and sense whether it was this type of tree or that type of tree, and what did this tree have to say. And that is the only answer, in my opinion, to what we're in, is that we have to go back to the earth and listen and sit and then come up with a creative new way of being, because indigenous cultures have done that since time immemorial. This land that we were on in British Columbia, you could have stuck your hand in a river and pulled out a salmon. That's how abundant it was. And now look at us. Look how far we've come away from that in just 100 years. Like just basically 100 and maybe 30 years. We have screwed things up and we have to fix it. Going back to the fixing thing, we have to go internally and know what our gifts are and how we can serve. And then we have to share that externally. And sometimes it goes both ways. Sometimes the universe gives us chances to learn externally and we change internally. But that sharing, I think, has to be rooted in an understanding of the body. We have to go back to our felt sensations.
Yeah. What do you have any thoughts on? I mean, one of the most serious issues in Vancouver is there's certainly homelessness, but people who had homes were surveyed, and they said that loneliness was profound. Do you think that people can do healing work by themselves? Like, I know this is another kind of both and question, but would you like to see, for example, friendships be more robust and people holding space for pain and not just being activity partners? Or, where, in other words, if you can pay for therapy, if you have access to that, that's great. But do you see other ways that people can heal, and I guess to bring it back to the theme, can admit their vulnerability, can open to themselves, and to others?
Yeah, I think we have neglected the community aspect of healing. We have neglected the systemic levels of healing. Like, this is something that, we've said that if you have a problem, it's because you're responsible for it. And sure, there's a level of truth to that. The stories that we tell ourselves, or the things that are in our control, our nutrition, our exercise, our social connections. But I think there's also larger collective influences too that affect us on a physiological, mental, emotional, spiritual level. What's happening collectively in the last few years has affected all of us. And I used to never be able to talk to anyone on the seawall or in a park in Vancouver. And I struggled so much with that. I've lived in places where it's not normal to ignore people. It's human, to connect, and we're social creatures and we need connection. And loneliness is driven by this overly yang, doing my identity is my work, workaholism, being applauded. Other countries are not like that. When I went to Norway, or when I was, in other places, even India, it's different. There are people enjoying their lives in Greece right now. They work for a few hours and they spend time with their family, and spending time with your family or your community or your friends is very, very socially required. Like it is, but I don't think we know how to do that in Vancouver. I think we have been I have many theories about Vancouver specifically. One of them is that it's where all the rivers meet the sea, and there's so much flowy lack of commitment, quartz crystal underneath our rocks, so it's amplifying this really flowy, connective, cool kind of Aquarius energy of like global sharing and all this stuff. But I think about that apartment building that you pointed out to me in the West End, where it's completely empty, right? And there's so many people that need houses, and people are paying millions of dollars for a 2-bedroom condo. And this is a city of glass built on a delta at sea level on a giant fault line. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, would the indigenous people have built a massive settlement there? No. Vancouver was from what I've learned, I'm still learning. So, if someone else knows more than me, please contribute in the comments and share more about this. But from what I know, that, the different nations used it as a gathering place. They would migrate in and out of Vancouver. It wasn't like, let's put a massive giant tower of glass on the ocean. Like, one day there will be an earthquake. And I think a lot of us feel that in Vancouver. And there's a sense of isolation, but also success, and like this driving forward of this kind of immigrant mentality, maybe of like, we need to make a life for ourselves, for our children, and we don't take a step back and be like, wait, what happened on this land before we got here? Like, let's just go back to, an ideal vision I have is, where my land is on Shishal territory on the Sunshine Coast. There was an article of an Indigenous woman saying, in 100 years from now or 50 years from now, it would be amazing if people from all around the world, like this global, we all come from different backgrounds and live here, we were all learning the Indigenous way of life in our education system. Our education was Indigenous and Indigenous led, because, like I said, that's the only way I can see a path forward. I think technology can be innovative and can help with healing and getting back to the earth, but ultimately it has to be based on meaningful, effective, collaborative relationships. If we don't have those relationships, we're going to wither and die. Like, that's the truth that I feel, is that relationships are where it's at, and different people and different groups of people fulfill different needs. And we cannot expect our partner or our friends to fulfill all of our needs. We need to get our needs met in many different ways, from many different people, in many different activities and different options, different choices. And I think we're slowly realizing that those fairy tale notions are totally wrong. But deep in our psyche, in our amygdala, our primal brain, we're still so in need of connection, and there's a lot of conditioning to undo. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, but I hope some of it made sense.
Oh yeah, all of it made sense. Part of my own theory about Vancouver is that it's such a beautiful place visually. I wonder how that has played into people being so image conscious here. And that's somehow related to their fitness level, their obsession with fitness. And as you know, with the yoga industry, I love that oxymoron of a phrase. Various yoga communities, different degrees of depth. And I think a word you use is authenticity, and different degrees of, like, for some people, yoga is just stress reduction. And so this could be a whole separate conversation, I'm sure, talking about yoga.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at is how there's something about the visual beauty of this place that has oriented, it seems to me, people towards, or privileging or foregrounding the visual dimension
Yes.
of themselves,
Yeah.
of which their bodies, and their image are an important component for them. And so, and part of that too is as you say, the materiality, the quest for status, more stuff. Like there was kind of an alternative spiritual stream in Vancouver, but it's also, the price of real estate is just through the roof, because it's such a beautiful place to live.
There's such a spectacle about it, right? Like it's such an awe-inspiring vista. It's such an amazingly beautiful place. I think you're right. There's this focus on how do things look over how do they actually function. Like, even the Telus building downtown apparently has all these sustainable, like supposed to have all these sustainability features, but none of them work because they're way too complicated and were not thought out. And I really feel inspired to go back to a simpler way of life. Like, let's just strip this down to the basics. Good food, good shelter, good people, healthy bodies, calm minds. Like, let's go back to that.
That's brilliant. I totally support that. It's wonderful. And may that spread, may that be manifest not just in your project with the land, but also through the world, through the universe. May all beings benefit from that degree of connection and simplicity and grace.
Thank you. That reminds me of this beautiful Sanskrit mantra that Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu, which is like, may all beings everywhere be happy and free. And yeah, I really appreciate your words. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have anything you'd like to say in closing? I feel like this is a good
I think it's a great place to stop. Yeah, I think this has been a wide, far-reaching conversation. And just, I guess, if you're a creative out there, a sensitive person, or a healer, or a teacher, you deserve your own care just as much as what you give to everybody else. You deserve to fill your own cup, because that's the only way we can serve others effectively. So go do your self-care, and not in that like annoying way of I should do self-care, like in the way of like, what would really be nourishing for you? I ask myself that a lot. Like, what would be nourishing for me today?
That's wonderful meditation to end with. And nourishing, I know for you means, physiological, but also spiritual, perhaps also mental stimulation, or, certainly emotional. Yeah. So, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Really appreciate all your emotional wisdom and you're having this conversation. I'm excited to listen to the other conversations that you have too.
Cool. Yeah, wonderful. All right. Well, take care. All the best to you.
You too.
And I'll see you before too long, I'm sure.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.